AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. Today we continue study of 18th century enlightened philosophers, and we are going to talk about Austria, and specifically about Maria Theresa, the Empress, and after that about her son Joseph. First, about the assessment. Basically, Maria Theresa is not an enlightened monarch in a sense like Frederick the Great was, or like Catherine II. She did not read Voltaire. She did not admire any one of those philosophers. She wasn't really into this fashion of reading and discussing in salons the literature of philosophers and thinking about how to make your country better, as Frederick did or as Catherine II did. So why was she called an enlightened monarch? What is it that puts her in the same rank? I think the common and simplest answer is common sense. The two things that drove Maria Theresa in her search how to serve her country were two things. Number one is the whole world was against her because of pragmatic sanction. Number two, she was simply she was guided by common sense, but what really practically made sense. And third, it was that she was a woman, and as a woman, she was a mother. She had 16 children, and half of them died. And that led her to be more humane. This explains uh, some of her reforms in medicine, in inoculation, and in education. So I think that rather than reading books and getting inspired of it, she was driven by life and by the tragedies he had to endure, especially the loss of her children, to make life better for other people, for subjects. So as humanism, I would say humanism and a desire to help common people is a simple sympathy, empathy to others. This is what you could say the source of reforms of Maria Theresa. So Maria Theresa was born in 1717, and she was the only heir to the throne of the Habsburg Empire. And that, of course, leads us to the pragmatic sanction, which means all kings of Europe had to agree, and France, Prussia, Saxony, and Russia did not. And that, of course, leads to the Silesian War and the first fight over that she had to endure. This was the same year, 1740. She is a young 20-year-old, and Frederick is the same about age, and they both the first year in power, and this is when they clash over Silesia. In her memoirs, she wrote, "I found myself without money, without credit, without experience, without knowledge, and without any counsel." So she felt quite lost, surrounded by all these enemies. So she loses this battle, and that leads us to the so-called First Silesian War that lasts through the 1740s and then goes into the same stories as we have heard, the Seven-Year War that begins in 1756 when Frederick invades Saxony, and then the alliances is formed against him, France, Austria, and Russia. And Maria Theresa's army does have a few successes. One of them is called the Battle of Kolin, where Frederick was defeated and a third of his army was destroyed in 1756. As you know from the preceding lecture, the war went badly for Frederick, and at one point, Russian troops were in Berlin, and he thought he was going to lose it. And Maria Theresa obviously was very happy because she didn't like him. She constantly wrote what a terrible man it was, and she never forgave him the loss of Silesia. Nevertheless, this leads us to something we discussed already before, which is the diplomatic revolution. This is one of the most important realignments of European powers in 1756, when Austria and France conclude an alliance. A result of that alliance, of course, is the marriage of Marie Antoinette, one of the daughters of Maria Theresa, with a young Dauphin, the future King Louis XVI. So this is crucial for the future of our relationship of Austria and France and the French Revolution, Marie Antoinette will, as you know, play a big role in this. So that's pretty much what we can say about the external affairs. Now, about internal affairs. Maria Theresa was very religious, as most people were at that time, and she was always raised by the Jesuits. The interesting thing is, like France and Austria follows the suit, in the middle of the 18th century, Jesuits are expelled from Austria, as well as they are under Louis XV from France. So because there's this overall feeling that the Jesuits are totally controlling education, that they have spy networks, that they engage in plots and all kinds of manipulations. So from Portugal to Austria, everywhere the Jesuits are chased out. Maria Theresa, just like Frederick, did not like the Jews, and she was very suspect of them. Now, there were hardly any Jews in Prussia, but there's a whole lot in Austria. Jews actually in Europe is Austrian Empire, the Habsburg lands, which is Poland and Ukraine, Lithuania, and Austria itself. So she had to have a policy to the Jews, and at first it was very tough. But later on, as we shall see, partly under the influence of Joseph, she completely turned around, and it led to toleration of religions and Jews. She was also very hostile to the Protestants. She was just like any other Catholic monarch. And the Protestants were transferred to Transylvania. They were abused, they were arrested, they were harassed, pretty much like in France. But under the influence of Joseph, as we shall see, she turned around, and this led to their terrible fights as as Joseph grew up. So let's see, by the time she was about 30 or 40, she didn't particularly do anything other Catholic monarchs wouldn't do. She fought wars. She was trying to improve her administration, and she wouldn't. If it stopped at that, she wouldn't be known as the great ruler of the 18th century. But then, of course, what does happen is that she does begin to lose her children, and the first thing that she does in response is entrust her prime minister von Swieten to establish a general hospital, which becomes one of the biggest and the best hospitals in Europe. And moreover, that leads her to introduce inoculation against smallpox, which was killing monarchs and peasants and others right and left in the 18th century. So she really is driven by her personal tragedies to do that. And the fact is that by the end of the 18th century, Austria and Vienna specifically becomes one of the best medical centers in Europe. And she does introduce inoculation to all children, including peasant children. So this is, of course, a big breakthrough. Civil rights. So it's so interesting that just driven by common sense, she realized you have to have the same law. Partly this was because Austria was so diverse. You had Hungary, you had Belgium, you had German-speaking Austria, you have Italian provinces, you had Slavic provinces. You have to have a law that would unify the country. And this is what leads her in 1776 to create, which is known, Codex Theresianus, so in Latin. This is, of course, systematization of law that tries to apply law systematically rather than being improvisation of the local nobles. The importance of that is that law is no longer in the hands of nobles and the church. The state institution, the state courts, are beginning to implement what would be known in Europe as Rechtsstaat, which means a state of law. And that's a novel concept because before that point, justice was pretty much in the hands of the church. Some of them were murderers and sadists from Inquisition. So this is a big step forward. Education. In 1775, which is 5 years before she starts ruling with her son, all children from the age of 6 to 12, boys and girls had to go to school. This is a revolutionary breakthrough. Nothing like that was done in France, and in England, it wouldn't be done until over 100 years later. I mean, the English would still have privileged elites and illiterate boys and girls in the countryside and in the cities. So it was as an astonishingly important humanist gesture that all boys and girls, including girls. I mean, nobody ever thought of educating girls from the age of 6 to 12 would have to go to school. That doesn't mean that immediately everybody became literate. Illiteracy continued for decades still, especially in rural areas. But the principle has been established, and the schools are beginning to be open. And they were not necessarily church schools. They were state schools, which means they were civil schools that had mathematics and language and religion and other subjects taught to kids. In 1765, her husband Francis, who was a co-emperor, so they had the same system um, as was practiced under William and Mary in England. So a woman and a man both were co-emperors. So he dies, and this is the moment when she appoints Joseph, her son, as the co-emperor. So now you have mother and son who both rule and become co-emperors. Um, and then, of course, have a lot of fights over policy, but I'll talk about it when we discuss Joseph. Um, in 1780, she died out of the consequences of smallpox that she herself was a victim of. After the death of her husband, she always wore black. She never had any other dress but black. She was in mourning all the time. So let's do a sum up. What stands out when we speak about Maria Theresa? As I mentioned before, she was not, let's say, if you compare the extent of her reforms uh, as Frederick the Great. She did actually much more than Catherine II managed, even though Catherine II was totally enthusiastic about ideas of philosophers and paid as much money as could be paid for the library of Voltaire and invited Diderot. So here's the comparison. It's two women, two great women. Catherine II was an enthusiastic follower of the philosophers. Maria Theresa was not. But in terms of what was accomplished for their country, Maria Theresa did manage to accomplish more. And it has to do not with the fact that Catherine didn't want to, it's just she couldn't in the conditions Russia was with, but we shall discuss it later. The most important and most productive comparison would be with France, because France misses all of this. There is no law code, the church reigns supreme, the Huguenots are being hanged, uh, there's tolls on the roads, there's medieval kingdom, and the king does nothing but sex with a million of his lovers, Louis XV. And then Louis XVI is a young boy imbecile who doesn't know what's going on. France is way behind compared to what is being done in Austria without any revolution and what is being done in Prussia. So that is the comparison that puts Maria Theresa into the rank of great monarchs of the 18th century. Don't forget to put your friends online and listen to AP European History with Dr. Brovkin. Thank you.